about the problem of high murder rates, especially in Black communities, what it does to neighborhoods. And basically, the status quo I feel we're at right now is that the right will talk about this issue. Tucker Carlson will talk about this issue. But you never get the sense that he's talking about it as anything other than a cudgel to wield against the left and say, look at Democrats fucking up these cities. And it's just a partisan hit point for him, right? You never get the sense that he is motivated to talk about that subject by a genuine ethical concern.
Compassion, right? For people who are dying. And
Right. And again, it is, I think it's possible that I'm slandering him, but this is the impression that I get, you know?
Well, it's not just an impression, right? Because if you were talking about it because you wanted better outcomes, then it would be a longer conversation, a more substantive conversation about how to get those better outcomes. And I agree with you. I think liberals need to talk more about that. I think the left talks about it a great deal more than liberals. But I think liberals need to talk more about it because by leaving that void, they do give cannon fodder to someone like Tucker Carlson, who's talking about it in bad faith. And in fact, there are good answers for that. So I think that some liberals, they do have this kind of performative virtue signaling relationship to some of these subjects, where because they're reasoning from the first principle, a lot of these white liberals, their reasoning from their first principle is racism is bad. I know racism is bad, and I don't really understand anything else because I'm kind of a vapid MSNBC host, but I know that racism is bad. So if Tucker Carlson says something that, quote, makes people look bad, I'm going to reject it out of hand. Instead of saying, okay, there is violence in low-income communities. There are high murder rates among these populations. And if I care as a good liberal about this, I should talk about ways to address it. Now, by not doing that, they allow other factions to get away with an argument that the way to resolve these issues is to increase funding to police departments. Now, if you showed me evidence that increasing funding to police departments meant that fewer Black people were dead in the street, people would have a hard time arguing with that. But what the whole argument behind, defund the police is that after years and years and years of throwing millions and billions of dollars at police departments, I think LA, 50% of the city's budget at this point is for the police. There is no correlation over a 30, 40-year trajectory between the size of police budgets and the rate of violent crime. And so we have to start having a different conversation about how you do bring down crime and what role does poverty play in all of this and what role does these concentrated urban developments play in this? And is there a way that we can work with architects and city engineers to help bring down the rate of crime? And because Tucker Carlson isn't talking about that and those solutions, that's what I think can lead you to a reasonable conclusion that he's not engaging in those topics in good faith. At the same time that we can have a criticism of liberals for not engaging in the topic at all because they don't really know how to deal with it.
Yeah. So yeah. And then there's, I guess, the second half of it, the problem is that if you do try to talk about this on the left or as a liberal, I think you become open to accusations of racism or Uncle Tomism if you're Black.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you were saying before about the fact that you can talk to me and Glenn and feel and be reasonably sure that we're coming from a good angle, that makes sense to me intuitively. At the same time, what happens if you are a white person that really cares about this issue for the right reasons? It's like you're under a cloud of suspicion from the start. You don't have the melanin force field, as my friend Camille Foster would say. And so it might seem wise to just wipe your hands of the issue altogether and say, I'm not even gonna, even though it's something I really care about, I'm just not gonna talk about it because...
And people make the decision, but look, I think it's a rebuttable presumption. I don't presume that every Black person is necessarily operating in good faith. And for the example about Tucker Carlson, I don't think, as I explained, I don't think he's operating in bad faith because he's white. I think he's operating in bad faith because he's picking and choosing arguments that don't really bear any relationship to positive outcomes for people in the community that he's kind of hand-wringing about, right? And look, I've been here. I'm Black and a woman, but I'm certainly not a lot of other things. I'm not... queer. I don't live with a disability. I'm not elderly. I'm not poor. There are a lot of things a lot of axes of, whatever you want to call it, privilege or what have you, that I am not on and that I talk about in the context of my career. And from time to time, people get very upset with me about things, and they, would like, I'm sure, some people to be able to cancel me or write me off for various things. And I talk about this on the show a lot. I make decisions, sometimes editorial decisions, not to go there. And other times I decide to go there because even though I know that I don't have the, what did you call it? The veil of
the melanin force field.
The melanin force field, or the LGBTQ force field, or I've gotten into some trouble over conversations that I've been having about Whoopi Goldberg and Judaism and racial identity. I don't have a Jewish force field. I don't have a lot of different kinds of things. I'll still be willing to do it and have the conversations. Because I think they're worthwhile, and I think I have something to contribute. And if it turns out I'm wrong and people want to push back, I think that's the whole point. I'm glad to have that conversation.
So now I'm curious, what was your take on Whoopi Goldberg that got you into trouble?
It didn't get me into trouble meaningfully with anybody who matters and cares. But, I had Thomas Chatterton Williams and Batya Ungar-Sargon on the podcast because I'd recently had this amazing conversation with Thomas last fall about his book, about being an ex-Black man and whether or not, the pros and cons of continuing to identify racially with a one-drop rule, given that it's a legacy of slave masters. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of led to this, this line of thinking and questioning after having 2 kids as a mixed race man himself with a white woman who came out looking just physiognomically very white, right? And the kind of the absurdity of saying like these kids should identify as Black based on this rule that was intended to keep the offspring of, raped slaves and slave masters under the property ownership of slaves. And it's like, well, why are we invested in this? And we had this conversation about, well, culture identity is great. And, the kids should be able to identify as culturally Black if they want to. And there's so much richness and wonder to be had there. But is there also like this inability to have this liminal state? And can't you be both? And it was interesting. We pushed and pulled and, but when Whoopi said what she said, and kind of questioned, the Holocaust isn't about race, she said. Mm-hmm. A lot of the pushback, a lot of the feedback was, well, Jews aren't white. Jews aren't white was the line. And while of course the argument that is correct and why Whoopi was wrong was that Nazis' conception of Jews was very much that they weren't white, that they were another race, and that made them targets for some of the cruelest, genocide that we've seen in the history of humanity. Mm-hmm. At the same time, today, very few people would make an argument that like Barbara Streisand isn't white, that Jared Kushner isn't white. And it was really interesting to me to say that, what is that slippage there? What is this conversation where it seems like in America to be subjugated, to have status as a marginalized group, race is the best way to get that status. So there is this investment in saying, well, Whoopi's wrong because of course Jews aren't white. When you could see a different approach, you can imagine a different kind of world where kind of religious persecution or some other kinds of identity had the same kind of power, and you saw a kind of a more nuanced argument. Some Jews are white, some Jews aren't, but they were perceived, or sometimes are continued to be perceived, depending on some combination of immigrant status and, how they look and whether they have an accent, all these other kinds of things. Like race is this weird thing that we all are struggling to define. But the uniformity of the response in that moment, which was absolutely Jews aren't white, when Jewish, it's an ethnicity and it's a religion and it has always existed in this kind of liminal space, that conversation wasn't being had at the time. And given what I just talked about with Thomas about the kind of political value of racial identity in America at this moment, I thought it was really interesting to get them together and kind of talk through what it meant to identify racially as opposed to ethnically, as opposed to religiously in a contemporary context, not just having this conversation about what was obviously the perception of Nazis in 1930s Germany.
It seemed to me why Whoopi's comments struck a nerve, and this was rarely acknowledged, because people were having this surface level conversation about history and whether Jews are a race or an ethnicity, whether they're white, etc. But beneath that, and I think motivating all of the outrage and excitement, was this unacknowledged intersectionality framework where Black people are obviously considered an oppressed class in this framework. White people are considered an oppressor class. And Jews they don't fit into the framework so neatly, right? There is an argument over, okay, are Jews oppressed because of, the pogroms everywhere in Europe and the genocide in Germany and all other, and even, being kept out of Ivy League schools for a long time in America, this whole history of oppression. So do they belong with Black people in the intersectional framework? Or since they are such a economically successful minority in America relative to their numbers, right? Like the average Jewish income is higher than the average American income, so forth. Are they therefore part of the oppressor class? And I think many Jews wrestle with that, because it's like I've seen examples of this at Columbia. It's like you're a Jewish student in the like sort of critical race class at school, and you try to say something from the Jewish perspective, empathizing with the Black struggle, and it's like, do you get shut down, or is that accepted? And there's status involved. There's a huge amount of status involved in these subcultures where you don't want to be the oppressor, you want to be the oppressed in this local subculture. And I think it's possible that was motivating some of the reaction to
100%.
Whoopi's comments.
I think you hit the nail on the head. But that's spicy for some folks, Coleman. Like, some people are not, I wanted to have my version of having the installation, the black shield. Sorry, I keep forgetting.
The melanin force
field. The melanin force field.
It's Camille Foster's thing.
Was having, a Jewish interlocutor on the panel. And asking her the questions and kind of getting to see what her thoughts and feelings were instead of offering something on my own. And, that's a kind of protection that I felt almost necessary to have that conversation, and the follow-up conversation I had on my call-in show later that day, where I had, Katie Halbert come on with me and continue the conversation. One, to have that, force field, but also because I'm genuinely interested in their perspectives that are obviously more informed than my own when it comes to how Jews see themselves. Obviously I want that perspective. But it is, I think that there are several things that you hit on that I will acknowledge are not always admitted to as issues among liberals or leftists, which is the idea that there is a such thing as a narrow cultural space that, despite broadly not having privilege or traction or hegemony in the country, in narrower cultural enclaves, there are these different power dynamics where there is status to be had by belonging to marginalized groups. And there is a way that the privilege discourse gets weaponized into a hierarchy of oppression that leads people to, instead of having a conversation about why we should care about the interests of Jewish people, instead becomes a battle about, well, are Jews white or not? Because the outcome of that decision militates how much we should care about Jews. Well, we can have the conversation, but regardless, your investment in the well-being of a historically marginalized community should be on the basis of their intrinsic value, not whether or not they can fit into one of these categories that has more clout or not. And that was kind of the root I was trying to get to in this conversation, which I thought was an interesting intellectual enterprise, but some people on, Twitter feel differently.